So, moving on to the next part of our show today. This is a question that was dropped into the Darkmoor podcast community Discord. So if you want any questions submitted or anything to hear on the show and our opinions or insights or whatever, feel free to go over to the Darkmoor podcast community Discord at darkmoorpodcast.com. So today's question is, this DM generally runs a very sandboxy style game. And their preference is that they'd rather have player decisions drive the story and then fit the quest and story hooks whenever it feels natural, and the players generally pick up on them. However, after the last session they had in a debriefing conversation, the players asked if this DM could use a more firm hand in driving the story because they felt overwhelmed with the amount of choices sometimes. So the question is, how do you have a firmer narrative without railroading? And one of the things that we had discussed prior to recording is just kind of quickly defining those terms. Sandbox and railroads are two terms that are highly emotionally loaded when you go into different forums or Reddit threads or anything. And a lot of times people aren't talking about the same thing. Both approaches can yield to meaningful results if they're set up right. But what the definition we'll be working with today is that a sandbox game is player driven, and the quests tend not to be immediate. Because if the quests are immediate, now the players have a specific road to follow, right? Or else bad things really happen and the players get punished. So it's not really players get to choose between a bunch of interesting choices. It's the players do the right thing and save the world, or they don't and something bad happens, So which really I don't think fits the spirit of what DMs who praise sandbox style games are really going for. And if they are, you might want to evaluate if you're actually running a sandbox game or if it's a railroad game hidden as a sandbox game. So the opposite being that a railroaded game, with the definition we're going to be working with, is DM driven. The DM gives the group a quest to follow. And this can lead to, this can include immediate circumstances. So it's like, there's a monster attack in that village we can see over there. Let's go help them, Although, the more I think on it, it might not be an immediate thing. It's just that the DM is the one presenting the quest for the players to go with. Now, one thing I'll say from a personal approach is that even if the players want to decide how to drive the story, they still want to give time for the DM to prep something that's going to be appropriate and immersive, as long as you're looking for an immersive game. Again, immersion is a high-level technique. And I found, for me, the sweet spot is actually presenting a railroad with where players can do anything they want in the cars, So a lot of times, DMs and players think of a railroad-style game as my choices are locked in, and it doesn't matter what I do, we're going to go to the next thing, right? Whereas a sandbox game, I have a lot of freedom, and I get to choose how my character works, and their choices matter and are meaningful and can affect the world. And I actually don't think that these two concepts are as mutually exclusive as a lot of DMs or players may make them sound. So to me, what works for me, and we just talked about this a little bit with Geras prep, a lot of DMs would look at my prep and say, wow, you have a really railroaded system going. So if you imagine it like a train on a railroad, the train is going to go where the train goes, right? It's on the railroad. But the train is also made up of a lot of individual cars, and what you put in those cars, the players can choose how they're going to interact with it, right? So you start them with an opening scene where you give them the quest, right? Now, the other thing with this is that what I establish with my players is when I give you a quest, we're assuming you're going to go on it, because now if the players choose not to do that and there's too many decisions that overwhelm them, now your game's going to meander, and it's really going to feel more like a waste of time than an energetically efficient investment of fun time, So after establishing the quest, the players go to the first scene. They move to the next car. How they choose to handle that scene will affect the next scene that I've prepped. If you make friends with the goblins, it may make it so that you don't have to fight the goblins later on. But if you slaughter all the goblins because they're goblins and they're worthless, well, you may have peeved off the goblin tribe, and it may complicate how you can affect the next thing. So you can see how their choices matter and they're meaningful and they affect how the world reacts to them. But still, you have something prepped, so that way you're not spinning your wheels trying to figure out how to keep everyone engaged. You're ready for them to be engaged. Sandbox games, this is my opinion, all right? So it's not a bearing on anybody else's. When I've been involved in a sandbox game, it feels a lot less focused and a lot less fulfilling for a lot more work on the DM's part.
Yeah.
Because it just, I don't know. Especially because most of the time we run into the, well, what do you want to do problem? And it's like, well, I don't know. You tell me what my clues are. Like, if you don't give me any information to act on, and then you want me to act, there's going to be decision paralysis because there's no clear. It's like if I drop you in the middle of a barren desert and I'm just like, what do you want to do? It's like, I don't know, die? Like, you didn't give me anything and I have no direction to go. Like, so, and unless you're like trained in survival and you can pick up on the clues, which most open world DMs don't do because they wanted the dice to decide, like either it's a sandbox with a clear route, which would then be a railroad, or it's gotta be, I don't know. Thinking back on it, there have been, just comparing the two styles, I have always found that either a sandbox game is not a true sandbox game, or it's just inefficient both in gameplay and in prep. So that's my very passionate opinion, because the more I play different D&D, the more opinionated I'm getting about it, because I'm sick of playing unfocused waste of time D&D. I want to do things. I want to play the game.
Yeah.
That's my goal. I'm here to play. I'm not here to,
Yeah. Like, I mean, that's why we play D&D. That's why we're playing D&D right now, not Minecraft or something like that. Like, there's, and like I said earlier, you want your game to feel like a sandbox, but what that means is you want your players to feel like they can impact the story and have agency, but you don't want it to be an actual sandbox, because an actual sandbox can be disorientating and confusing and unsure.
Yes,
paralyzing.
That's the key thing, is the
unsure.
And unsure is like, there's a difference between being unsure about what do we do versus making a tough choice.
Yeah.
Right? Because a tough choice has two very defined choices and maybe a Kobayashi Maru, right?
Yeah.
But that's different than literally not having anything to go on and kind of meandering.
Yeah.
Well, I remember Adam talking about that in an earlier episode. Like, by early, I mean like episode 20. He would talk about how frustrating it is to meander, right? And that's what true sandbox games are, is meandering, right? Only way for a true, fulfilling, player-driven sandbox game is your players need to have general and personal knowledge of the world, and as players they need to do their homework and metagame, right?
Yes.
So they need to metagame to say, I want to go to Waterdeep because Waterdeep is the city of splendors, and if we talk to the mass council, but so many players would be uncomfortable with that because first of all, you have to do a lot of homework and make a lot of assumptions about the world. Also, you have to, as a player, acknowledge the amount of player knowledge that you're bringing to the table to navigate whatever the established setting is. And you almost can't do that with a custom setting unless that custom setting has a setting Bible. And most players, I will say 95, 98% of players are repelled by a setting Bible. Like, none of us have sat down and gone through every page of Explorer's Guide to Wildmount to like memorize every region and city name, right? And also, that may not make sense for the campaign that you're running, but you have to do that if you're going to run a true sandbox, because the players need to have enough knowledge to be able to drive their own gameplay. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.